There is a particular kind of book that earns its title honestly, and this is one of them. Stephen B. Sample spent decades as a working leader, president of the State University of New York at Buffalo through the 1980s, then president of the University of Southern California from 1991 onward. And somewhere along the way, he became convinced that most of what passes for leadership wisdom is not merely useless, but actively harmful. The Contrarian's Guide to Leadership is his attempt to teach what he actually learned, stripped of the platitudes and motivational gloss that clog the genre. What follows is a summary of that book, a guided walk through its argument, its examples, and the practical philosophy that holds it together. Sample writes as an engineer who became an administrator, a former professional musician who never lost his ear for the unconventional, and a man who has clearly enjoyed proving the conventional wisdom wrong. His central conviction is simple and bracing. The qualities that make someone a competent manager are frequently the opposite of the qualities that make someone an effective leader. Where the manager decides quickly, the leader suspends judgment. Where the manager keeps a tidy desk, the leader procrastinates artfully. The book is organized as a series of these inversions, each one illustrated with stories drawn from politics, business, the military, religion, and the academy. It closes with a case study of his own decade at USC, where these principles were put to work, a word about how to read it. Sample insists his book has no pretensions of being an all-of-a-piece treatise. The chapters can largely be read out of order, and he invites the reader to keep what is useful and discard the rest. But there is a spine here all the same, and following it from beginning to end reveals a coherent vision of what leadership is. An art rather than a science, situational rather than formulaic, and far more demanding morally and intellectually than the airport bookstore version would have you believe. Thinking Grey and Free. Sample opens with the two mental habits he considers most foundational and most rare. The first he calls thinking grey. Most people, he observes, are binary and instant in their judgments. They sort everything they encounter into true or false, good or bad, friend or foe, the moment they encounter it. This reflexive sorting is harmless enough for ordinary life, but for a leader, it is a quiet disaster. It closes the mind to facts that arrive later. It produces flip-flopping as the leader believes the last thing the last person told him, and it leaves him vulnerable to a danger Nietzsche identified. The human tendency to believe whatever we sense is strongly believed by others. Sample reaches for Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiment, in which subjects could be induced to deny the plain evidence of their eyes about the length of a line simply because everyone around them did so first. The leader who can think grey, who holds an important question genuinely open until circumstances force a conclusion, and who recognizes that many questions never require a conclusion at all, has built the best available defense against that pull toward the herd. He is careful to distinguish thinking grey from skepticism. The skeptic files everything in the not-true box and demands evidence to move it. There is a cynicism in that posture which followers find dispiriting. The grey thinker files nothing at all, remaining equally open to embracing an idea or rejecting it. And he is careful, too, to keep the discipline in proportion. One need not think grey about lunch or music or which movie to see. Those trivial decisions are in fact perfect practice ground, small occasions to rehearse the suspension of judgment, so the skill is ready when something weighty arrives. The companion habit is thinking free, moving past the comfortable cliché of thinking outside the box to something harder and colder. Sample's image is of climbing out of a heated pool on a brisk day. The out-of-the-box thinker shivers for a moment and retreats indoors. But the free thinker stays out in the cold until his teeth chatter, tolerating discomfort long past the point of pleasantness, because that is where real invention lives. The method is to entertain genuinely outrageous possibilities first and apply the constraints of cost, legality, and practicality only afterward. He offers a memorable personal example. Struggling in 1967 to invent a new control system for a dishwasher, he lay on the floor and forced himself to imagine hay bales, elephants, planets, and French horns, each controlling the machine. An exercise so uncomfortable he could only sustain it 10 minutes at a time, but one that eventually produced a digital control scheme that found its way into hundreds of millions of home appliances. What gives this chapter its quiet weight is Sample's insistence that leadership is fundamentally an art, not a science. He invokes Mozart composing, the jazz soloist freeing his mind to make new associations on the fly, Shakespeare coining words and stretching old ones, all of them thinking free in their own domains. The most important innovations in any field, he notes, often come from newcomers too naive to know what supposedly can't be done. He saw this firsthand at Buffalo, arriving in 1982 to find a flagship university held in contempt by its own faculty and townspeople, yet possessing every underlying strength needed for greatness. Because he and his wife came from elsewhere and could see the place freshly, they recognized what the locals could not. And within 9 years, Buffalo had been elected to the prestigious Association of American Universities. The lesson sits comfortably with anyone who has watched fresh perspective accomplish what entrenched expertise could not. That the capacity to see what is actually there, undistorted by the assumptions everyone around you takes for granted, is among the rarest and most valuable things a leader can cultivate. Artful listening. The average person, Sample notes with affection, labors under 3 delusions: that he is a good driver, that he has a good sense of humor, and that he is a good listener. Most leaders are in fact terrible listeners, mistaking talking for the more important activity, and the Contrarian corrects this by listening first and talking later, and by listening with genuine art. This is not a matter of making people feel good, though it does that. It is the leader's single best instrument for gathering information and assessing the people who provide it. Much of the chapter concerns the leader's circle of advisors, and here Sample draws repeatedly on Machiavelli, whose counsel he finds far wiser than its reputation suggests. The inner circle should be small, no more than 8 or so, and built on trust so deep that any member feels free to tell the leader his plan is simply wrong. At USC, that circle was his 5 senior vice presidents and his wife Catherine, his closest and longest-serving advisor, from whom he accepts the harshest criticism precisely because he trusts her motives most. He pauses to note something the leadership literature rarely mentions: that a stable long-term marriage turns out to correlate strongly with leadership success, a point Warren Bennis documented among the CEOs he studied, contrary to the cultural assumption that the powerful person is forever trading up in spouses. Beyond the inner circle lie the elected and appointed advisors, boards, faculty senates, committees, and the perpetual flood of unsolicited advice. The central skill in handling all of them is discerning whom an advisor truly represents and how firmly. Sample warns against the advisor who inflates a handful of complaints into "the faculty are upset," and he invokes a kind of Heisenberg uncertainty principle of leadership. The very act of asking a constituency what it thinks can manufacture an opinion that did not previously exist, as many a deposed dean has discovered after a faculty poll crystallized discontent that had been merely latent. The artful listener probes, asks who is saying what to whom, and seeks independent accounts of the same event from people whose biases he already knows. He extends thinking grey into what he calls listening grey, absorbing complaints and claims without immediately rendering a verdict, and illustrates it with his practice of the temporizing response. When someone complains of mistreatment, he assures them their concern is taken seriously and will be investigated, without ever conceding that their account is accurate, because he does not yet know. The most charming illustration of artful listening's power is his old friend Sam Regenstreif, a dishwasher manufacturer with thick glasses and a confusing manner who disarmed every negotiator across the table by seeming a befuddled bumpkin, while in fact he was always the most attentive listener in the room, steadily revising deals to his advantage. The deeper teaching here resonates. That real attention to another person, patient, unhurried, refusing to rush them into a category, is both a practical instrument and something close to a form of respect. Experts, saviors, and charlatans. No modern leader can function without experts, lawyers, scientists, accountants, architects, consultants. And yet, Sample observes, a startling number of leaders have been brought low by the well-meaning assistance of the very experts they hired. He confesses his own conflict of interest at the outset. As a career academic, he is himself a producer and member of the expert class, and so writes about its failings with both affection and candor. His father's terse verdict, delivered in front of a rust-streaked building on a Missouri street when Sample was 7, "Son, never trust an architect," becomes the chapter's refrain, gently amended into the Eric Hoffer-flavored principle that a leader should attend to experts closely, but never take them too seriously and never trust them completely. The deep problem with experts is that many of them serve their own egos and the esteem of their professional guild, rather than the client who pays them. Frank Lloyd Wright stands as the cautionary monument here. A genius, certainly, but one who treated the Martins of Buffalo as wealthy ignoramuses, lucky to live in and pay for his creation, producing a celebrated work of art that failed entirely as a home. Sample saw the surviving correspondence himself during his Buffalo years. The same egocentrism appears in the graphic designers who insist on tiny type to preserve artistic integrity, while ignoring that the client's elderly donors cannot read it. The remedy is Bennis's distinction between the expert as deep specialist and the leader as deep generalist. The expert supplies superior insight in a narrow domain, but only the leader can integrate competing expert advice into a coherent course of action, and to do so, he must know precisely what his own goals are. Sample's own resolution of USC's architecture question is instructive. Though his personal taste runs modern, he recognized that what matters is not his preference, but what best serves the university's mission, and so USC began tearing down its dreary 1960s buildings and returning to the beloved Italian Romanesque style. The longest stretch of the chapter is a genuinely useful meditation on science and technology, which Sample insists are distinct and have been so for most of human history. Technology advancing for hundreds of thousands of years by trial and error with no help from science, which itself began in Greece and then largely vanished for a millennium. Only over the last 2 centuries have the two fused. He explained scientific falsification clearly, quoting Einstein that no amount of experimentation can prove a theory right, while a single experiment can prove it wrong, and he draws the leader's practical lesson. What matters is not whether a theory is ultimately true, but whether usable technology can be wrung from it. The danger zone is the social sciences, whose theories resist falsification. He contrasts the swift discrediting of cold fusion in 1989 with the century it took to dislodge Freudianism, and where a leader is far more likely to be misled by confident-sounding pseudoscience. The thread running quietly through all of this is the conviction that reality is genuinely knowable, that some claims correspond to how things actually are and others do not, and that a leader's first defense against manipulation is the discipline of asking which is which. You are what you read. This chapter, the heart of the book in many ways, argues that leaders are largely the product of what they read, and that most of them read precisely the wrong things. The conventional leader buries himself in trade publications, management bestsellers, and the daily news, ephemera that will be forgotten within years, and that mostly tells him what his competitors already know. The contrarian does something stranger and more rewarding. He digs for gold in what Sample calls the supertexts, the small handful of works at least 4 centuries old that are still widely read because they speak to permanent features of human nature. The Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, Shakespeare, Plato's Republic, Machiavelli's Prince, these are the books that repay a leader's attention because the fundamental dynamics of power, ambition, loyalty, and betrayal have not changed since they were written. Sample's case rests on a claim about human constancy, that beneath the surface churn of technology and fashion, people remain remarkably what they have always been, and that the ancient texts therefore offer more reliable guidance about leading them than any contemporary study. He pairs this with a pointed contrarian habit regarding the popular media. The leader, he argues, is better off largely ignoring the daily news, trusting his lieutenants to surface anything that genuinely matters, and refusing to let the press's obsession with the urgent crowd out attention to the important. To read the supertexts while one's competitors stay mired in the trades is to acquire a depth of understanding they simply cannot match. There is something deeply congenial in this counsel, the recognition that the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the texts that have survived precisely because generation after generation found them true, will outlast and outperform whatever the present moment is certain it has discovered. Decision-making, Sample writes, is where a leader exercises most of his power and where his legacy is ultimately determined. And almost everyone approaches it backward. Raised on a clean desk ethic of never putting off until tomorrow what can be decided today, leaders make far too many decisions, far too quickly. The contrarian governs himself by two rules that scandalize conventional wisdom. Never make a decision yourself that can reasonably be delegated to a lieutenant, and never make a decision today that can reasonably be put off until tomorrow. The first rule rests on a hard truth most aspiring leaders cannot accept, that one must delegate decisions while retaining full responsibility for them, including the bad ones. Sample tells the possibly apocryphal story of Defense Secretary McNamara during the 1961 Bay of Pigs, ordering a single ship back into formation, only to have the Chief of Naval Operations reply that he would happily relieve the fleet commander, but would not, while that man remained in charge, tell him how to position his individual ships. Jack Welch grasped the principle at General Electric, where decisions of $25 million or less were left to operating officers. Delegation conserves the leader's scarce time, develops strong lieutenants who can only grow if permitted real decisions with real consequences, and, most counterintuitively, builds a more coherent organization because the leader who delegates is forced to assemble a team of shared values that can survive his eventual departure, where the dictator leaves behind only factional wreckage, as Yugoslavia did after Tito. The decisions a leader should keep are those touching his chief lieutenants and those with the greatest potential impact on the whole enterprise. He must distinguish the urgent from the important, shielding himself from the sirens of the media as Ulysses stopped his sailors' ears with wax. He must know whether he even possesses the authority to decide a given matter. Sample recounts deftly determining, when his Buffalo law faculty tried to ban military recruiters, that the authority to bar anyone from a university building lay with the president alone, which transformed the faculty's ban into a mere recommendation and let him avoid a two-front war over both who decides and what the decision should be. He praises George Washington's genius for deferring to legitimate authority and thereby, in Gary Wills's phrase, asserting authority by deferring to it. The second rule he calls artful procrastination, and Harry Truman is its patron saint, forever asking first, "How much time do I have?" knowing that the timing of a decision can matter as much as its substance, and that subordinates almost always press for speed because a fast decision is likely to be the one they want. Sample folds in the related discipline of ignoring sunk costs, since decisions can only affect the future and never the past. The whole chapter carries the steady realism of someone who understands that a leader's resources are finite, that not every fire deserves his attention, and that the wisdom to know which battles are genuinely his own, captured in the prayer of St. Francis he quotes, is itself the better part of leadership. Give the devil his due. Here Sample stages his most provocative argument, that of all the advisers in history, the leader should choose Machiavelli. He imagines a cocktail party where Plato, Mother Teresa, and Machiavelli each slip the contrarian their resume, and the contrarian, after thinking grey about it, hires Uncle Niccolo. The point is not to endorse cruelty, but to rescue the most misunderstood of the supertexts. Plato dreamed of philosopher kings and ideal republics. Machiavelli answered, across 2,000 years, that a man who abandons what is done for what ought to be done courts his own ruin, since he lives among many who are not good, and that a leader concerned with survival must therefore learn how not to be good, and how to use or withhold that capacity according to need. Sample sketches Machiavelli's life with real sympathy. The Florentine official tortured after the Medici restoration of 1512, who maintained his innocence, retired to his farm and wrote The Prince, then presented it as a gift to the very family whose agents had broken him. He quotes Bernard Crick's striking image of Machiavelli as a sword plunged into the body of Western humanity, causing it a pain still felt today. The argument Sample builds is that genuine moral seriousness in leadership requires looking clearly at how human beings actually behave rather than how we wish they behaved, that the leader who refuses this clear sight, who insists on governing an imagined world of uniformly good people, will not only fail, but will betray the very people who depend on him. This is the chapter's quiet paradox, and it lands with force, that an unflinching realism about human fallenness far from being the enemy of moral leadership, may be its precondition. Know which hill you're willing to die on. Most people, Sample observes, confuse good leadership with effective leadership, and the contrarian knows the difference is vast. Hitler was an extraordinarily effective leader, at least during his rise and first decade. No one would call him good. Effectiveness can be assessed by visible criteria: a compelling vision, the ability to inspire sacrifice, the choice of capable lieutenants, relentless drive. Goodness cannot be assessed at all without recourse to moral values, and specifically to the values of whoever is doing the assessing. The goodness of a leader, unlike his effectiveness, lies genuinely in the eye of the beholder. And yet, Sample insists, this does not dissolve into relativism, because the leader still must answer the question of what is right, and must answer it for himself. He frames this through a series of escalating moral dilemmas. His father taught him at 16 to run over an animal in the road rather than swerve and endanger people, conveying the principle that human beings matter more than animals. An old army ethics test sharpens it. A soldier driving a bus on a mountain road must choose between killing a child who darts after a ball or plunging off a cliff to his own death. And most recruits chose the cliff, until the scenario added 19 other soldiers aboard, at which point the arithmetic of lives demanded staying the course, though almost no one could imagine actually doing it. These questions are so painful that most people refuse to face them. But facing them, Sample argues, is the very essence of good leadership. To know which hill you are willing to die on is to have decided in advance which principles are non-negotiable, and to understand that choosing one hill may require retreating from all the surrounding ones. The chapter speaks to anyone who believes that moral choices are real, that they cost something, and that the refusal to count that cost honestly is a failure of leadership, rather than an escape from it. Work for those who work for you. The title captures the chapter's whole inversion. Sample learned it in 1971 from George Clements, the chairman who had built Jewel Tea into a national chain, who told the 30-year-old Sample that a leader should spend roughly 10% of his time hiring, evaluating, compensating, and when necessary, firing his direct reports, and the other 90% doing everything possible to help them succeed, serving as their first and best assistant. It is powerful advice precisely because it is so rarely followed. Even leaders steeped in democratic management theory struggle to think of their lieutenants as their equals, let alone as people they ought to be working for. Sample drives home that effective day-to-day leadership is not the glamorous calling the literature depicts. The leader's own plate is heaped with minutiae, while his lieutenants get the consequential and enjoyable work. Anyone hungry for glamour should try acting in the movies instead. He quotes Teddy Roosevelt on the best executive, one who recruits competent people, tells them what he wants, and gets out of their way, amending it only to insist that the leader must also actively assist his lieutenants and forge them into a team. Genghis Khan's genius, he notes, lay above all in his uncanny ability to find excellent generals. The deepest decisions a leader makes are about people, and the willingness to pour oneself out in unglamorous service of those one leads, to perform the grungy chores beneath one's putative station so that others can flourish, is presented not as self-abnegation, but as the truest form of authority. There is something quietly profound in this picture of leadership as service, in the reversal that places the leader beneath those he leads. Follow the leader. What exactly is a leader? Sample, ever insistent on clear definitions, offers his own. A leader is someone with identifiable followers over whom he exercises power and authority through his actions and decisions. This precision leads him to a deliberately provocative judgment. That Eleanor Roosevelt, however admirable, exemplary and influential, was not properly a leader, because she lacked identifiable followers over whom she exercised authority. Influence and nobility are not the same as leadership, and conflating them muddies our understanding of both. Followers, he argues, are the sine qua non of leadership. Before one can lead, one must acquire them. Some leaders inherit ready-made followers with an office, as a CEO inherits employees. Others, like civil rights leaders, must build a following from nothing. Many in democratic societies must continually persuade potential followers to grant them authority. He examines the varied bases of that authority: institutional office, combat prowess, compelling vision, or in the case of religious leaders, a putative relationship with God that confers power without formal position. The genuine test of leadership, paraphrasing Truman, is whether a leader can get others to move willingly in a new direction they would not naturally have chosen. And when the real leader turns, his followers turn with him. Sample is honest too about the reverse current, how followers sometimes lead their leaders, a dynamic the wise leader watches carefully rather than denies. Being president versus doing president. The most quietly wise insight in the book, Sample says, came from a colleague who wanted nothing to do with leadership himself. In 1970, when Sample had just won a fellowship to intern in a university president's office, a respected senior engineering professor named Vern Newhouse remarked that he had spent his life observing ambitious men and had learned this. Many men want to be president, but very few want to do president. Sample has found it absolutely true across 30 years. Some of the unhappiest people he knows are those who clawed their way to the top of their professions only to discover, upon arriving, that they had no appetite for what the job actually required, having pursued the position because they thought they were supposed to, and sacrificing along the way the work they were genuinely good at and genuinely loved. This is the chapter where Sample turns most directly to the reader's own life. Being president is a matter of status, title, and the imagined satisfactions of having arrived. Doing president is the daily reality of the grungy, demanding, often thankless work the previous chapters have described. He counsels anyone aspiring to high leadership to look hard at whether they want the doing and not merely the being, and to stay away from the leadership business altogether if they belong only to the former group. The wisdom here is unmistakably about vocation in the older sense. The recognition that a calling is a thing one is actually suited to and summoned toward, not a prize one grasps for the sake of having grasped it, and that a life spent climbing a mountain one never wanted to stand atop is among the sadder forms of human waste. The University of Southern California, a case study in contrarian leadership. The book closes its argument by grounding it, walking through Sample's own decade at USC from 1991 to 2001, years in which many observers felt the university gained more academic ground than any other institution in the country. He is quick and convincing in disclaiming personal credit, assigning the lion's share to his administrative team, his faculty, his staff, his far-sighted donors, and a board willing to stay the course when the going got rough. But he shows how nearly every principle of the preceding chapters was put to work. The 4-month interregnum he negotiated before taking office let him think grey and listen grey, hearing from the Trojan family about their hopes and fears before he bore any responsibility to act. The decade began brutally, with California mired in recession and USC forced into the first major layoffs in its history. 800 positions eliminated, 500 of them held by real people, an 8% reduction that was destabilizing in a way such cuts rarely are in higher education. In keeping with contrarian wisdom, Sample implemented the entire painful set all at once, rather than stringing them out. A decision that exemplifies knowing which hill to die on and refusing to let yesterday's sunk costs govern tomorrow's choices. Throughout, he relied on his small inner circle, delegated relentlessly while holding responsibility, and made the few genuinely consequential decisions himself. The case study works because it is not a victory lap, but a demonstration. Proof that the contrarian principles are not clever paradoxes for the seminar room, but instruments that built something real, and that institutions, too, can be turned around by leaders willing to see them freshly and serve them faithfully. Closing. What Sample finally offers is not a formula. He is emphatic that no infallible step-by-step recipe for effective leadership exists, and certainly none for good leadership, but a coherent stance toward the work. Think grey and think free. Listen first and artfully. Use experts without being used by them, and beware the pseudoscience that masquerades as certainty. Read the supertexts while your rivals drown in ephemera. Delegate ruthlessly and procrastinate artfully. Ignore sunk costs, spare the defeated their humiliation, know which hill is worth dying on, and work for those who work for you. Beneath all of it lies the recognition that leadership is highly situational and contingent, and that the leader can never finally know whether he is the architect of history or merely its pawn. to which Sample's answer is that the morally preferable course is to act as though one is fully responsible for one's actions, history and fate notwithstanding. Taken whole, the book establishes that real leadership is an art demanding intellectual independence, moral seriousness, and a willingness to serve, and that the conventional wisdom is to be distrusted precisely where it is most confident. Seen from a certain angle, the deepest current in this book is its quiet realism about human nature. Its insistence that people are neither better nor worse than they actually are, that the leader's task is to bring out the best in them while restraining the worst, and that clear sight about all this is more loving than any comforting illusion. Sample's confidence that reality is genuinely knowable, that moral truths are real and cost something to honor, that the wisdom of the ancients outlasts the certainties of the present, and that leadership rightly understood is a form of service performed beneath those one leads. All of this gives the book a depth that its breezy, contrarian surface might at first conceal. It is, in the end, a book about character as much as technique. Read the whole of it. Sample is a far better and more entertaining guide than any summary can convey, and the stories, dilemmas, and turns of phrase that fill his pages reward the time spent with them many times over.